Most people assume that if you want bigger, healthier vegetables, you need to plant them straight into the ground. More soil sounds like more opportunity, more room for roots, more moisture, more nutrients, more production. On the surface, that idea makes complete sense. But surprisingly, that isn't always true. In fact, some vegetables actually grow better in containers than they do in traditional garden beds. They stay cleaner, they suffer from fewer soil-borne diseases, they deal with fewer weeds. They're easier to water, easier to harvest, and in many cases, they become even more productive because containers create the exact conditions those plants prefer. That's the real secret. Containers give you control. You control the soil quality. You control the drainage. You control the moisture level. You control where the plant sits, how much sun it gets, and how protected it is from bad weather. And when you give the right vegetable the right container, you're not limiting it, you're actually setting it up to thrive. In today's countdown, we're covering 15 vegetables that often grow healthier, cleaner, and more efficiently in containers than they do in the ground. Some of these will surprise you. And make sure you stay until the end, because the number one vegetable on this list is so perfectly suited for container growing that many gardeners eventually stop planting it in the ground altogether. Let's begin. At number 15, we have radishes. Radishes are one of the fastest vegetables you can grow, but they're also one of the easiest to mess up in poor garden soil. If the ground is compacted, rocky, or heavy with clay, radishes struggle almost immediately. Instead of forming smooth, crisp roots, they stay small, become woody, or grow into strange, uneven shapes. That's where containers make a huge difference. A container filled with loose, fluffy potting mix gives radishes exactly what they want: soft soil with no resistance that allows the roots to swell quickly and evenly, which means better shape, better texture, and faster growth. And because radishes mature so quickly, even a short delay caused by rough soil can ruin the result. Containers remove that problem right away. Another advantage is temperature. Container soil warms up faster in early spring than heavy garden soil does, and that helps seeds germinate sooner. For gardeners who want quick results, that matters a lot. Radishes are already fast, but in containers, they often feel even faster. They're also easier to keep weed-free. Since radishes are such a short-season crop, they don't have much patience for competition. A few weeds in a garden bed can slow them down. In a pot, managing that problem is much simpler, and when it's time to harvest, the entire process becomes easier. Instead of tugging roots from stubborn ground, you're pulling them from soft mix that releases them cleanly. It's a small difference, but it makes the crop feel much more rewarding. For beginners, container radishes are often one of the first real signs that gardening can be easy, fast, and genuinely satisfying. At number 14, we have spinach. Spinach is famous for being productive in cool weather and frustrating in warm weather. One minute it looks perfect, and the next it bolts, turns bitter, and practically ends the harvest overnight. In a traditional garden bed, you can only do so much about that. But in containers, everything changes. The biggest advantage is mobility. When spinach starts getting too much sun or heat, you can move the container into partial shade. That single option can extend the harvest significantly. Instead of watching the crop decline in place, you can respond to changing conditions in real time. Ground-grown spinach doesn't give you that luxury. Containers also improve drainage, which is important because spinach likes evenly moist soil, not soggy roots. In heavy garden beds, especially after rain, the balance is harder to manage, but good potting mix makes it much easier to keep spinach comfortable. There's also the cleanliness factor. Spinach leaves growing low to the ground often get splashed with mud, nibbled by slugs, or damaged by crawling pests. Raised containers don't eliminate every problem, but they often reduce them enough to make a noticeable difference. And because spinach has relatively shallow roots, it doesn't need a huge amount of soil depth to perform well. That makes it ideal for gardeners with limited space. A modest planter near the house can produce repeated harvests without demanding a full backyard garden. Spinach is a perfect example of how container gardening doesn't just save space. Sometimes it gives sensitive plants a better chance to succeed in the first place. At number 13, we have green onions. Some vegetables need room to sprawl. Green onions are not one of them. In fact, they're one of the most naturally container-friendly crops you can grow. Their root systems are compact, their growth habit is upright, and they don't ask for much horizontal space. That means you can grow a surprising number of green onions in one relatively small container. For apartment gardeners, balcony growers, or anyone working with a patio instead of a garden bed, that's a huge win. But convenience may be the biggest reason they perform so well in pots. Green onions are one of those crops you use constantly in the kitchen. A little here, a little there, a quick garnish, a fresh topping, something to throw into eggs, soups, noodles, or salads. When they're planted out in a distant bed, you have to go out of your way to grab them. When they're sitting near your door, harvesting becomes effortless. That convenience changes behavior, and when something becomes easier to use, it becomes more valuable. Containers also provide the loose, fertile, well-drained soil green onions prefer. In the ground, especially in compacted areas, growth can be slower and stems can stay thinner. In a container, they establish quickly and often regrow beautifully after harvesting. Another hidden benefit is cleanliness. Rain-splashed soil in garden beds can make onion tops dirty and less appealing. Elevated containers keep the plants tidier and easier to manage. There are very few vegetables that give you this much production, this much usefulness, and this much simplicity from such a small growing space. That's what makes green onions such a smart container crop. At number 12, we have beets. Beets don't always get the same container gardening attention as carrots or radishes, but they probably should. Because when you think about what beet roots need, containers start making a lot of sense. Like many root crops, beets struggle in hard or rocky soil. Misshapen roots, stunted growth, and rough texture often come from one basic issue: resistance underground. Garden beds aren't always as loose as they look from the surface, but containers let you create the perfect root zone from the very start. That means softer soil, fewer obstacles, and more evenly developed beets. Another reason they do well in containers is that you get two harvests in one crop. You're not only growing roots, you're also growing beet greens. And when those greens stay cleaner, more tender, and easier to access, the plant becomes even more useful. Containers also simplify spacing. In a regular bed, beets often end up overcrowded or unevenly planted. In a container, it's easier to control exactly how many plants you're growing and how closely they sit. That leads to better development and less guesswork. And then there's harvesting. Pulling beets from soft container mix is far easier than wrestling them out of dense soil, especially when the roots are larger. That makes the whole crop feel more approachable, especially for newer gardeners. Beets may not be the first vegetable people think of for containers, but once they see how much cleaner and more manageable the process becomes, they start to understand why pots can actually be the better option. At number 11, we have lettuce. Lettuce is one of those crops that seems simple until the weather turns against you. In the ground, heat builds up, pests move in, leaves get dirty, and bolting can happen fast. But in containers, lettuce becomes one of the easiest vegetables to keep productive. The first reason is flexibility. Lettuce hates extreme heat, especially when afternoon sun becomes intense. A garden bed is stuck where it is. A container isn't. You can shift it into a cooler location, move it into partial shade, or protect it when temperatures spike. That can keep the plant sweet and tender for much longer. The second reason is accessibility. Lettuce is usually harvested a little at a time, a few leaves today, a few more tomorrow, and the plant keeps producing. When it's growing close to your kitchen, that rhythm becomes effortless. You harvest more often, waste less, and enjoy fresher greens. Containers also reduce exposure to some of lettuce's worst enemies. Slugs, snails, and splash up from wet soil are often less of a problem when plants are elevated. And because most lettuce varieties have shallow roots, they perform extremely well even in smaller planters. Another major advantage is succession planting. Lettuce doesn't need a massive commitment. When one round finishes, you can quickly refresh the container and sow the next batch. No digging, no bed prep, no major cleanup. Just replant and continue. For people who want steady harvests without a lot of hassle, container lettuce often feels less like gardening and more like having a living salad bowl right outside the door. At number 10, we have carrots. Carrots are probably one of the best examples of a vegetable that sounds like it should prefer the ground, yet often performs better in a container. The reason is simple. Perfect carrots need perfect soil, and perfect soil is hard to find in an ordinary garden bed. Even when a bed looks soft on top, there can still be hidden rocks, dense patches, old roots, or compacted layers underneath. Carrots hit those barriers and respond by twisting, splitting, forking, or stopping altogether. That's why so many homegrown carrots turn out short, crooked, or oddly shaped. Containers solve that immediately. Fill a deep pot with loose, stone-free potting mix, and suddenly the root has a clear path downward. No obstacles, no surprises, just smooth development from top to bottom. The difference in shape alone is enough to convince many gardeners. There's also an early season advantage. Container soil tends to warm faster in spring, which helps carrot seeds germinate more quickly. Since carrots are sometimes slow to emerge, that extra boost can improve both patience and success rate. Weed pressure is another issue that containers help reduce. Carrot seedlings are delicate at first. In a crowded bed, weeds can easily compete with them. In a container, control is much easier, which means less frustration during those vulnerable early stages. And when it's time to harvest, you're not digging through stubborn ground. You're pulling roots from a medium that actually wants to let go. Sometimes growing better carrots isn't about more land. It's about removing the hidden problems that land often brings with it. At number 9, we have bush beans. Bush beans are already known for being beginner-friendly, but containers make them even more practical. Unlike pole beans, they don't need towering support systems or a large footprint. They stay compact, productive, and surprisingly efficient in a pot. One major reason they do well in containers is warmth. Beans prefer warm soil for fast germination and healthy growth, and containers reach those warmer temperatures faster than many spring garden beds do. That means quicker starts and often earlier harvests. Bush beans also benefit from cleaner growing conditions. When they're planted in the ground, rain can splash mud onto the lower leaves and pods. Wet soil can create mess, and crowded beds can make harvesting more annoying than it needs to be. In a container, the pods stay more visible, cleaner, and easier to pick. Another advantage is weed reduction. Young bean plants don't love competition, and in-ground rows often require more maintenance than people expect. But in pots, the environment is easier to control, which lets the plants focus on growing instead of fighting nearby weeds. For smaller spaces, bush beans are one of the best examples of high return from a modest setup. A few containers can produce repeated harvests with very little complexity. That makes them perfect for gardeners who want food, not fuss. And because the plants stay fairly manageable, they suit patios and urban spaces especially well. You don't need a sprawling bean patch to enjoy fresh harvests. Sometimes a few well-placed pots can do the job beautifully. At number 8, we have eggplant. Eggplant loves heat. That one fact explains a lot. In many regions, traditional garden beds warm slowly in spring, especially if the soil is heavy or the nights stay cool. Eggplant doesn't love that hesitation. It wants warmth around the roots, warmth in the air, and a strong, consistent start. Containers often provide exactly that. Because pots heat up faster, eggplants frequently establish more quickly and begin growing with more confidence than they do in the ground. That faster start can lead to earlier flowering and better fruit production later in the season. They also appreciate the improved drainage containers provide. Eggplant does not enjoy sitting in wet soil, and when roots stay overly moist, the plant can stall. A quality potting mix gives you much more control over that balance, which helps keep the plant vigorous. Another benefit is sunlight management. Eggplants need plenty of it, and if one part of your yard gets better exposure than another, containers let you take full advantage. Instead of settling for a fixed location, you can move the plant where it will thrive. And there's something else people often forget. Eggplants are beautiful. Their purple flowers, glossy fruit, and upright shape make them one of the most ornamental vegetables you can grow. In a container, they don't just produce food, they also look impressive doing it. For gardeners with limited space, that combination matters. You want a plant that earns its place. Eggplant often does that with both beauty and productivity. At number 7, we have cucumbers. Cucumbers can be incredibly productive, but in the ground they often come with problems. The vines sprawl everywhere, the fruit hides under leaves, airflow suffers, and disease pressure increases fast, especially in humid conditions. Containers offer a smarter setup. When cucumbers are grown in pots with vertical support, the vines climb instead of spreading. That immediately improves airflow, which is one of the biggest defenses against mildew and fungal issues. Healthier leaves usually mean healthier plants, and healthier plants usually mean better harvests. Vertical growth also makes harvesting easier. Instead of digging through a mess of tangled stems and oversized leaves, you can actually see the fruit hanging in front of you. That means fewer missed cucumbers and better timing when it comes to picking them young and tender. Another major advantage is fruit quality. Cucumbers lying on damp ground are more vulnerable to rot, discoloration, insect damage, and misshapen growth. But when the fruit is suspended and clean, it tends to look better and stay healthier. Containers also help with water management. Cucumbers like consistent moisture, but not the kind of soggy unpredictability that poor garden drainage can create. With a container, it's easier to respond quickly and keep conditions steady. For small space gardeners, cucumbers are a reminder that productivity doesn't always come from growing wider. Sometimes it comes from growing upward. At number 6, we have potatoes. Potatoes may seem like a field crop, but they are surprisingly satisfying in containers. In fact, for many home gardeners, containers make potato growing easier from start to finish. The biggest reason is harvesting. In the ground, harvesting potatoes can feel like a guessing game. You dig carefully, hoping not to stab or slice the tubers, while also trying not to leave any behind. It works, but it can be messy, slow, and frustrating. In a container or grow bag, that entire process becomes simpler. When the plant is ready, you dump the container and collect the potatoes directly. No treasure hunt through hard soil, no accidental damage from aggressive digging. That alone is enough to win many gardeners over. But there are other benefits too. Fresh container mix reduces exposure to some soil-borne diseases, and the drainage is usually better than in dense ground. Since potatoes dislike sitting in overly wet conditions, that improved control helps keep the crop healthier. Containers also make it easier to grow potatoes where garden space is limited or non-existent. A sunny corner, a patio, a driveway edge, or a few grow bags near the fence can suddenly become productive. And psychologically, potatoes in containers are just fun. Very few gardening moments feel as rewarding as tipping out a grow bag and seeing a pile of fresh potatoes appear all at once. It turns harvesting into an event. Sometimes the best reason to grow something in a container isn't just efficiency. It's that the experience becomes easier, cleaner, and more enjoyable. At number 5, we have peppers. This surprises a lot of gardeners, but peppers often perform exceptionally well in containers. In some cases, they even outproduce plants growing in the ground. One reason is root behavior. Pepper plants don't always need huge amounts of space below ground to perform well above it. In fact, slightly confined roots can sometimes encourage the plant to direct more energy into flowering and fruiting, rather than excessive leafy growth. Then there's the warmth factor. Peppers love heat, and containers warm up faster than most garden beds. Warmer roots help the plants establish more quickly, bloom earlier, and continue producing more confidently through the season. Drainage also matters. Peppers want steady moisture, but they do not want wet feet. In heavy ground, that balance can be harder to maintain, especially after storms. Containers, especially those with a high-quality potting mix, make moisture control far more predictable. Mobility is another major advantage. If your peppers need more sun, more protection, or a better position during a heat wave or storm, you can adjust. That kind of flexibility is impossible with fixed garden beds. And from a practical standpoint, peppers are perfect for patios and balconies because they fit the space so well. A medium container can support an impressively productive plant without taking over the area around it. Peppers prove that a compact growing system can still deliver major results when the plant's real needs are being met. At number 4, we have cherry tomatoes. Large slicing tomatoes can be demanding in containers, but cherry tomatoes are a completely different story. In fact, many cherry varieties seem almost designed for this style of growing. The first advantage is disease reduction. In traditional beds, tomatoes are constantly exposed to soil splash, inconsistent drainage, and poor airflow around dense lower foliage. That creates the perfect setup for fungal problems. Containers help reduce some of that pressure by lifting the plant, improving airflow, and keeping the root zone more controlled. Cherry tomatoes also fit container limitations much better than giant fruited varieties do. Because the fruit is smaller, the plant can stay highly productive without needing the same level of support and root volume required by larger tomatoes. And productivity is exactly what makes them so appealing. A single healthy cherry tomato plant can keep producing for weeks or even months, sending out clusters again and again. Instead of waiting for one or two big fruits, you get a steady stream of small rewards. That ongoing harvest changes the feel of the plant. It becomes generous, reliable, constantly useful. Support systems are also easier to manage in a container. A cage or stake can be added directly to the pot, keeping the plant upright while using minimal space. That's ideal for patios and balconies where every square foot matters. For people who think container tomatoes are difficult, cherry tomatoes often become the variety that changes their mind completely. At number 3, we have garlic. Garlic may not be the flashiest crop on this list, but it's one of the smartest. And for many gardeners, containers solve some of garlic's biggest hidden problems. The most important issue is moisture. Garlic hates sitting in overly wet soil for long periods, especially during colder weather. In many garden beds, especially those with heavy soil or poor drainage, that becomes a real risk. Bulbs can rot, fungal issues can increase, and growth can suffer long before harvest time. Containers make that much easier to control. A loose, well-draining potting mix gives garlic the kind of environment it prefers from the very beginning. That helps bulbs expand more cleanly and reduces the danger of waterlogged conditions after rain. Containers also make weed management easier during garlic's long growing season. Since garlic spends months in place, weed competition can become annoying in a regular bed. But in a pot, maintenance is simpler and more contained. Another overlooked advantage is weather protection. If conditions become too severe, whether it's excessive rain, a brutal cold snap, or a stretch of unpleasant weather, containers give you options. You can move them to a more sheltered area, which adds another layer of control traditional beds simply don't offer. Garlic is not a demanding crop day to day. Plant it, water it sensibly, let it grow, and wait. That quiet reliability becomes even more appealing when you combine it with the cleanliness and control of a container. At number 2, we have strawberries. After growing strawberries in containers, a lot of gardeners never want to put them in the ground again. And once you think about the problems containers solve, it's easy to understand why. Strawberries grown in beds face a long list of annoyances. Fruit rests against damp soil. Rain splashes mud onto the berries. Slugs and insects find easy access. Rot develops where fruit touches wet ground. Runners spread everywhere and turn simple patches into messy systems that need more maintenance than expected. Containers fix almost all of that at once. They lift the fruit off the ground. That means cleaner berries, less rot, less mud, and easier harvesting. It also means fewer pests reach the fruit before you do. And when strawberries are grown in hanging baskets, towers, or raised patio pots, picking them becomes far more comfortable too. Then there's the runner issue. In a traditional bed, strawberries naturally try to spread in every direction. In containers, they stay more organized. You still get productive plants, but you don't get the same level of takeover. Another huge advantage is drainage. Strawberries like moisture, but they absolutely do not want their roots sitting in soggy soil. Containers often give them a healthier balance than heavy ground can provide. And perhaps most importantly, strawberries in containers feel premium. They look better, they stay cleaner, they're easier to reach, they make the whole crop feel more rewarding. Sometimes container growing doesn't just improve plant health. It improves the entire experience of eating what you grow. And finally, at number 1, we have basil. If there's one edible plant that seems made for container life, it's basil. Basil thrives in warmth, it loves good drainage, it responds beautifully to regular harvesting. And it becomes even more useful when it's growing close to the kitchen. All of that makes it one of the most natural container crops you can imagine. One of basil's biggest weaknesses in the ground is excess moisture. After heavy rain, traditional beds can stay wet longer than basil likes, and that leads to stress, disease, and sluggish growth. Containers solve that problem immediately. Potting mix drains better, warms faster, and gives the roots the kind of environment basil actually wants. That better root environment translates into bigger harvests. Another major advantage is airflow. A well-placed container helps reduce fungal pressure while giving the plant the warmth and exposure it needs to stay lush and productive. And because basil responds so well to frequent cutting, having it nearby changes how often you use it. That's one of the biggest hidden benefits of container basil. Accessibility increases harvest frequency, and harvest frequency often increases production. The more you trim it properly, the bushier it becomes. The bushier it becomes, the more useful it is. And the more useful it is, the more valuable that one container feels. Basil also suits container growing aesthetically. It looks good on patios, porches, steps, and window sides. It doesn't need much space, but it gives a lot back. In many ways, basil is the perfect final example of what container gardening does best. It takes a plant's natural preferences and creates a controlled environment where those preferences are easier to meet consistently, and that's exactly why it earns the #1 spot. The biggest mistake many gardeners make is assuming that bigger growing space automatically means better results. But that's not always how gardening works. Sometimes the ground gives you more room, but also more weeds, more disease pressure, more drainage issues, more pest access, and less control overall. Containers may offer less volume, but they often create better conditions, better soil, better drainage, better mobility, better cleanliness, better access, better efficiency. And for the right vegetables, those advantages matter more than raw space ever could. That's why so many container-grown crops end up healthier, easier to manage, and more productive than people expect. You don't always need a large garden to grow impressive food. Sometimes a few well-placed pots can outperform a much bigger patch of ground. And once you start seeing how much control containers really give you, you stop looking at patios, balconies, porches, and sunny corners as leftover spaces. You start seeing them as opportunities.